On today's show, I talked to Paul Biggar, tech founder of CircleCI, a unicorn, and Darklang. Paul is also an activist for Palestinian freedom and justice. At the beginning of the show, we experienced some technical difficulties and lost about a minute of audio. This is your host, Omer, and welcome to the Ozone Podcast. Paul Biggar, welcome to the Ozone Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell me a little bit about your background?
Sure. So my background is basically software engineering, computer science, and startups. I did my undergrad and my PhD in computer science in Trinity College Dublin, and then I moved to San Francisco to do startups. I got into Y Combinator, and then I started a company called CircleCI and ran that for a number of years. And then I started a company called Darklang, which I've been working on until December last year.
What is CircleCI?
So CircleCI is basically workflow automation for software engineers. So the CI in our name means continuous integration. That term doesn't mean a whole lot, but it basically is the name that software engineers use for the automation tools that helps them get code from their computers into the cloud or into production where it can get used by their users.
And what is Darklang?
Darklang is a project that I started with the idea of reducing and removing all of the complexity from software engineering. So I looked at all of the problems that existed in how people write cloud software, everything from dealing with the cloud to getting code into the cloud and many other related problems. And I tried to come up with a solution where those problems wouldn't exist. And that solution is Darklang, darklang.com. What that is basically bringing together a programming language and the cloud and some other elements of it into a single package. And by doing that, we get to remove a great deal of the complexity from software development.
Thanks for sharing a little bit more detail about your companies. And CircleCI is a unicorn, which is quite impressive. A few months ago on your personal blog, you wrote an eye-catching piece called I Can't Sleep. A few months into the Gaza genocide, you kind of talked about its personal effects on you and how it changed your outlook on life and some of the actions you recommend. This post went viral and caught the attention of the tech world and the world in general. Is this the first time that you've engaged in activism, or is this something that you've done in the past?
Of apartments being bombed and of many of these, many of the photos of what was happening on the ground. I was watching those and it was just having this like really profound effect on me. And I couldn't sleep. That's why I called the blog post that. I was lying awake at night and I was thinking about those photos and the children, but not just the children, just seeing the homes and the lives that were destroyed. And so I started thinking about like, what can I do? It's a situation that many of us recognize from very early on as being genocidal and as being different to many other conflicts that we had seen, and recognizing that this wasn't business as usual and that you had to sort of stand up and do something. And we had seen people stand up for Ukraine, for Black Lives Matter. You asked if I had been an activist. I went on marches with Black Lives Matter and posted about it. And I also had written a couple of blog posts about some issues in the past. One around Peter Thiel's donation to Donald Trump and what effect it had on the startup ecosystem that Peter Thiel was from. And then also about some misogyny within the Silicon Valley community, which was in the zeitgeist in 2018. I'd written blog posts on those. The first one didn't really go anywhere, but the second one went fairly viral. And so it wasn't my first rodeo, but what I recognized was writing is a thing that I can do, and that's the thing that I'm good at. So I need to find a way that I can write something about this in a way that I hope could have some impact.
Yeah, I mean, it was really powerful. I was speaking to a friend of mine who's also in the tech world, and he said it gave him chills, and I would say similar. I had similar feelings. Like I read that, I've been reading it again a couple times before talking to you, and it's powerful through and through. And I would say when you said you can't sleep because when you're thinking of all the children dying and screaming, I think that you're echoing sentiments for maybe billions of people in this world. A lot of the people who don't have voices, who can't really at least voices that aren't being projected in Western media. I think there's a lot of people going through that mental trauma, and of course, that pales in comparison to what's going on the ground in Gaza. We can't even compare it. But like that kind of anguish, I think it's really relatable because I think in the past 6 months, a lot of us have been going through similar stuff.
I think it was a point where there was a transition, where this transition had already occurred about, what we should be feeling, because on October 7th, everyone felt this sort of sympathy with Israel. Then over the next month, 2 months, honestly, within weeks, it turned so aggressive, so genocidal, so quickly that the narrative had not changed, but our feelings on it had. So those of us who were paying attention to social media and were watching what was happening had very rapidly changed to recognizing the awfulness of what Israel was doing to the Palestinians, the post October 7th awfulness, because obviously there was also pre October 7th awfulness, but it was different in magnitude. But the narrative was still so pro Israel, and people were still, and especially people in power. And for me, it was people in the tech industry, the powerful people in the tech industry were so pro Israel in what they were saying at the time that we could see this awfulness happening, and seeing all the people being killed. And there hadn't been an opportunity for people to speak up because of the chilling effects of Israeli propaganda and Israeli propagandists who were shutting down any sort of conversation. And so I think my blog post arrived at a time where that transition was just starting. And now it's been a couple of months later, and there has been like a significant change in the narrative. We are at a point now where, even though the Israeli narrative is fighting hard, the pro-Palestinian narrative, and I'll just say the pro-humanity narrative, is starting to pervade, and to reach everywhere where it wasn't able to reach before. But when I think people saw my blog post, that was the first time for many that a voice had come out saying that without being immediately shut down.
Very interesting post. I'm going to quote one of your a paragraph that really struck a nerve with me. Sometimes I work out how many people my taxes have killed. Intrusive thoughts. Maybe they're used for roads or healthcare, but maybe I bought a bomb last year and erased a city block in Khan Yunis. Maybe it killed 50 people. Maybe I killed 50 people. And the reason I talk about this is something that, I often discuss with my friends and family. Obviously we live in this country, we're good citizens, we're taxpayers, with great intentions, but it does hurt that, somehow just by living here, we're involved in this and you're having similar thoughts. Can you tell me a little bit more about this thought?
Yeah, so the idea, I suppose, is complicity, right? There's the US is complicit in this, and those of us who supported Biden, in the last election, and turned out, I think people could have told us at the time, maybe they did, and we didn't listen, but told us that Biden was an awful human being who we now see as a racist, a genocidalist. We're now seeing what the leadership in the US is doing. And I think up until this point, we could see it in a little more of an abstract way. We could see, that since 9/11, that there was all this Islamophobic or anti-Arab sentiment. We could see, obviously the disastrous wars in Iraq, and Afghanistan that were, that came out of that sentiment. But it was for many people in America a full lifetime ago. For me, it was half a lifetime ago. It was really, not something I was aware of when it was I mean, I knew of it, but I didn't really, see it deeply as this sort of symptoms of imperialism and colonialism and that sort of thing. That's a much later awakening for me. So I think just a lot of people recognize that complicity for the first time, because it became a lot more concrete when it is the ally, possibly the number one ally of the United States, and where the United States has such power to prevent it and to stop Israel, which it has done historically in many cases and refused to do now. It really sort of highlighted the role of the United States in doing this.
I believe you're of Irish background, and one thing I've noticed is the Irish are very supportive of Palestine and freedom movements. Do you think your background played a role, or maybe how you grew up in terms of being supporting a freedom movement, or do you think this is something independent of that?
Absolutely. So I grew up mostly in Ireland. I've spent maybe half my life in Ireland at this point. And part of being Irish is that we are an oppressed people in our national identity, in our history, in our music. An awful lot of it is about the colonialism of the British to Ireland, which continued throughout my childhood until the Northern Ireland peace process ended. And we know about the famine, but we know, oh, the famine was actually caused by the English, and here's how it was done. And then as you grow older and you learn a lot more, and you start to see these patterns, it's like, oh, the Irish famine looks a lot like the famine in India that was caused by the British in the 40s. You start to see these patterns, and so people see the pattern with Palestine, right? It's Ireland is the only colony in Western Europe, and it is one of the only places that really identifies with our colonial past that is, at the same time white and English speaking. And I think that somewhat unfairly probably creates this position of Ireland as a people who believe the right thing that are believed by the West to have opinions that are valuable.
Yeah, Ireland really seems like an outlier in Europe. I mean, standing for freedom. Right now, it seems like almost every European country, and I'm not talking about necessarily the people, but like the governments are all pro-Israel. But Ireland is really speaking up for Gaza, and I can see the protests there. Irish actors, Irish politicians have been pretty vocal on that. So I think that's quite impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're Irish, you have a lot of criticisms about what your own government is doing. But I think, certainly relative to most other governments in the world, we're on the right side of things.
In the tech world, I think one of the first kind of well-known casualties of, so to say, speaking their mind was Paddy Cosgrave of Web Summit. And
Right.
I believe what he said is very benign, actually. It wasn't controversial. He said war crimes are war crimes even when committed by allies and should be called out for what they are. And then he said he was devastated to see the level of innocent civilian casualties in Israel and Gaza. And I think he lost his job because of that. What were your thoughts when you first heard that? Because I think that's before your blog post, correct?
It was, yeah, it was maybe 6 weeks before my blog post. I think Paddy being fired was a key moment because a lot of us realized the emperor has no clothes, right? We saw what he was cancelled for. It would be considered benign now. It was to me, at the time, it was considered quite forward, but at the same time, it is an obviously true statement, right? It is not even a thing that has any. It is just like factual. It's idiomatic. And so the fact that he got cancelled for saying it's like, how did this happen? What is the situation where that happened? And that was revealed to us in a blog post that came out later by independent journalists Lee Fang and Jack Tolson called Inside the Pro-Israel Information War. And it told us exactly how. It told us that there was a WhatsApp group of 300 tech leaders who consulted with the IDF, and who decided that they would cancel Paddy and they would do it. And it was run by Bessemer, which is a venture fund. It was run by two partners in Bessemer Israel, whose names are Amit Karth and Adam Fisher. And it started, they orchestrated this. They started this. They got Josh Koppelman from First Round to start it. And then they got, they arranged for a set of people to pile on, and that is how that thing happened. What we saw from that, it highlighted other campaigns against a Wix employee in Ireland and against Paul Graham, who's a big name in tech. When we saw that, it was very clear to us, oh, the reason that all this is allowed to happen is because people in key positions of power are actually pulling the strings. And they're actually, this propaganda that we perceive is orchestrated, is organized, and in most cases, it's connected to Israel. And this is a thing that I now recognize as Hadbra, and I now recognize as this sort of like broad movement that is very deliberate and has been running for a very long time. But at the time, it was just like, something clicked. It was like, what is that thing? How did that happen? And so I think even though, Paddy getting cancelled is obviously terrible, and I think he's basically uncancelled now since that article came out. But I think it also was a key point in the shift of the narrative to people recognizing, oh, the reason that we're not seeing the things that are happening and that we're not seeing change on this obvious genocide is because there's people manipulating, whether it's tech or the New York Times or Congress or Biden. There's things happening there that we weren't aware of.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Paul Graham, and he's been kind of a breath of fresh air in the VC toxic culture. But even his posts, they weren't even like he just mentioned how many people have died, this many children have died, this is terrible. And the responses he was getting was like, you're a terrorist supporter, pro genocide. I mean, very benign statements. And I think people who not necessarily just in that circle, but in general, if you post anything like that, people were getting quite a bit of hate for just common decent comments. And I think like you mentioned, Paul Graham, he was just it did seem coordinated, all these attacks. So it kind of echoes what happened to Patty with the
Mm-hmm.
article that you're talking about. Getting to your story, can you tell me about losing your board seat on Circle CI for how did that happen?
So I don't actually know how that happened. If I had to guess, because I wasn't told like the specifics of what happened, I do know. I was voted out by the rest of the common stockholders. And what that basically means is that other shareholders who were, VCs basically voted me out. And that was something that they were legally able to do. And so it's not, an employment thing. I didn't lose any money over it. And it was a 10-hour a month job at most. So I wasn't super concerned about it. But the thing I didn't like about it is the narrative that it put out. And I think that is the reason that they did it. I think there was an investor within Circle who they needed at a key time who told them to do this. And I'm not sure who that was. I'm not sure the specifics, but that's my suspicion. And it's all part of the same thing that we were discussing. You have to show that that there are consequences to speaking up against Israel, to speaking up for Palestinians, or speaking up for humanity. And that's kind of why you see this sort of thing to Paul Graham. Paul Graham does not care what people say to him on Twitter. But if they show what happens to Paul Graham when he speaks up, even if it's just attacks, then it creates this environment of fear and intimidation for anyone else who's thinking of speaking up. And when you speak to Arabs in tech or Muslims in tech, it's very few have spoken up. And part of the reason for that is this level of fear and intimidation. And that's the strategy behind these things, right? They don't really care if I'm on the board or I'm off the board. But by showing that there's a consequence, even if the consequence is actually, in my case, benign, it helps support that fear.
How hard is it to sacrifice your career for your stance? I know, like you said, it's relatively benign, but I mean, Circle CI is, you're the founder, it's your baby. So, like, was that intimidating, or was that just spurred you to become more vocal?
I think it didn't really affect me because I was already on this trajectory. In terms of like the damage to my career, I don't actually believe that my career has been damaged. And in fact, I think kind of the opposite. Because beforehand, I was someone who'd had one success, and The second one wasn't going so well. That this is Dark Lang. And now it's like this is someone who, you know, put everything on the line, sacrificed. I mean, I'm not saying that, but I think it is the perception. And that, it puts a lot of people in your camp. And so I think my company was at a place where, it was actually quite difficult to raise money because we hadn't hit that level of success that we needed for it yet. But the effect now is that people are actually reaching out to us and are saying we want to be involved with you because we believe in the sort of thing that you've done. So ironically, it's sort of like one of those one door closes, another one opens.
Hmm.
And I think that people, I definitely don't want to say that there's no consequences for people speaking up. There are definitely, but I think that the consequences aren't always as catastrophic as people portray.
A lot of people, like you said, Muslims and Palestinians and Arabs are probably a little bit more scared to speak out because they are fearing that cancellation. What do you recommend to balance being vocal versus kind of losing that livelihood? I mean, does a person have to be financially independent before they can really go all out, or what do you advise people if they ask you that?
I do get asked that a lot. And I think I primarily get asked that by Arab founders and Muslim founders. I think it's interesting because we shouldn't expect that the people who are most jeopardized by these policies, right? I don't think it's reasonable to say that the only people who should speak up are Arab. We've sort of ended up putting the responsibility, and I say this I mean sort of as a society, we've ended up where the responsibility lies with the affected group instead of saying that as Americans and as frankly as white people or people who have the most privilege within America, those are not the people who are asking me how they can help, what they can do, and they should be, because it just isn't reasonable to put it all on people who are already marginalized by American society. So the things I say to, let's just call it founders of privilege or people of privilege within the tech industry or just within America at all, it is, this is your responsibility to address. This is something where you can't see Arabs and Muslims speaking up because it's so dangerous for them, but you have to lead and put yourself out there to create a space for Arabs and Muslims to be able to speak up and to normalize people speaking up. The thing I would say, and I've been asked this question a lot by Arabs and Muslims, balancing the risk level versus the impact that you can have. Because I think what people want to do is they want to do a full-throated social media, come out there and say what they really feel. And that's valuable for people to do that. But if you are rightly scared or intimidated or get significant risks from that, you can do smaller advocacy. You can speak to your friends. You can make sure that people that you trust and know, including powerful people like your mentors or your investors, if that's people that you feel safe talking to. You can have an effect even without doing the huge social media push, and that risk level is something that you can first you can identify what your own risk level is, and secondly you can look at the zeitgeist and say, for this week, right? Because the narrative changes so rapidly and it's so, becoming pro-Palestinian greatly every single month. You can say, well, the situation right now is this, and that means that with the risk level that I have, I feel that, I can do a retweet this week, or I can talk to more people right now. And you can sort of figure out your own level of risk tolerance. And I think that's really what people are trying to do. They're trying to have some sort of impact while they're in this environment of fear and intimidation. And going for like the full throated thing is what's or the idea that that's what they have to do, I think is what's stopping people from having, still good impact. When I see people who are having impact right now, it's sort of thing where they're going to their local cities and they're getting their cities to put out resolutions. And that's something that they do somewhat anonymously, right? We don't know the names of the people who enabled those resolutions to get passed, but it helps change the narrative, and it does it in a relatively low risk way.
In big tech, there seems to be a lot of surveillance or monitoring of speech. And I'm kind of referring to Meta platforms, X, and
Mm-hmm.
even Google in terms of maybe some of the surveillance. What are your thoughts on that being in the tech industry? Like, is that something that is we should be aware of or it's pervasive? And are there any solutions to that?
It is definitely real. You're not imagining. It is something where several big tech companies are explicitly suppressing pro-Palestinian speech. Meta is probably the worst. This is a policy that's created by a guy called Guy Rosen, who is their CSO, their chief security officer, and that is actually someone who, it's a super senior person, and he was a person who was in the IDF. He is a person who lives in Tel Aviv, and who was actually in this sort of intelligence unit called Unit 8200, where an awful lot of the people in tech were stationed in the IDF. And so what we've got is, where this huge platform that has a massive effect on the United States policy, and honestly, which is having this massive negative influence on United States policy, because it's causing the United States to spend goodwill that it had built up over 70 years on supporting a genocide that isn't even its own genocide. It's being done by an ally, and that, to a certain extent, that decision is being enabled by, one guy. And I don't want to say that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't bear responsibility for that as well. Of course he does. But where that significant impact is being made by someone who, is literally in the army that is doing the genocide. And the same is true in various different ways across the different social media platforms. On LinkedIn, which is one which, people don't think of it, but it's a huge social media platform. It's owned by Microsoft, but there's one guy in that who is controlling and shaping the narrative, and that's recognized by the leaders of it, by the by the leaders of Microsoft, and they're allowing that to happen. Same or similar in, well, different in Twitter, but like a similar kind of thing. And all of the social media platforms have some variation of this going on. So you're not imagining that. In terms of solution, I don't have any idea. This is one of the things that's most difficult. In Meta, what's happening now is Meta is actually trying to turn the phrase Zionist or Zionism into a protected class, so that anyone who says something that's anti-Zionist can be shut down as hate speech. And so that's the level of sort of not just complicity, but indoctrination of these platforms, and the level of bias in these platforms. It's absolutely out of control.
Do you recommend any messaging app? A lot of people use WhatsApp, including myself and a lot of my circle. I know that's owned by Meta, so a lot of people want to migrate to Signal or
Yeah,
Telegram. Do you think that that's a legitimate concern, and do you have any recommendations on that?
absolutely. I've been slowly migrating over to Signal. Signal just launched a usernames feature, which now you can communicate with people without them knowing your phone number, which is an even bigger win relative to WhatsApp. So I recommend Signal to most people.
Excellent. What is Tech for Palestine?
So Tech for Palestine is an organization that me and about 40 other people started in January this year. And, at its most basic level, it's a collection of people who are coming together to build technology and tools that help advocate for Palestinian humanity and for Palestinian lives in the tech industry. We're looking at basically all the things that are wrong with the tech industry, the dehumanization of Palestinians, and all the sort of like effects that lead to that, and trying to figure out what can we do to combat them.
Is there anything that the audience or listeners can do to kind of help or join that movement, or is it something that you guys are just doing from your end and it'll kind of reach people that way?
In January, we opened it up to the world, and at this point, 4,000 people have joined. And the main thing that we do is we connect volunteers to projects, and we need volunteers of all kind. There's a lot of value to engineers and designers and product managers and people who are in these technical roles. But there's also a huge amount of opportunity for people to do research and data entry and that sort of thing. There's a lot of projects that need that sort of those sort of skills that most of us have, so long as you're organized and you have a couple of hours to spare. It is something that can be really valuable. And to do that, you join our Discord you go to techforpalestine.org, you join our Discord, and then there's a list of volunteer opportunities available there.
I'm going to reference your blog again. I Can't Sleep. You made another poignant statement that you realized what would people be doing if this was the Nazi Holocaust, and a lot of the people that you knew would apparently be supporting it, and because they're kind of cheering on this genocide right now. I've always thought for a long time, and again, this, with a caveat, only if you're educated on the topic, not for the average person who doesn't know much. But to me, Palestine has been kind of a litmus test of one's morality. Does one stand for freedom and justice of an oppressed people, or do you side with power? What are your thoughts on that? Like, if you have all the information and you're seeing babies being killed, do you think that's a fair thing to say? And the reason I want to mention that in respect to your blog is I have some friends, who have seen the previous Gaza massacres, but now they say they view people differently based upon whether or not they support the genocide. Anyone who kind of supports the genocide or Israel, they're like, we just don't want to have a relationship with those kind of people. We don't want to do business with those kind of people.
Yeah, I think it is absolutely an ideological litmus test. There are, obviously a lot of people who identify with Israel, or who are Israeli, who felt attacked or whatever. But being able to be so callously one-sided when you can see, I was going to call it a genocide. I stand by the word genocide for it, but even if you don't, you know, educate yourself to the point of being convinced that the word genocide applies, just being able to look at what is happening and to say, oh yeah, we support Israel in this, that's great. It's obscene. It's disgusting. When you see, soldiers who are like, get kids in the scope of their sniper rifle and put a bullet through their forehead, like, are we talking about the same thing here? It's maddening. And so the idea that someone could support Israel when they're doing these things, and when these things are so evident, and not only that, there's some people who are not just supporting Israel, but are holding water for them, who are fighting for Israel to be able to continue this war. Biden is doing it. Tons of politicians are doing it. The New York Times is doing it, right? The New York Times is creating a propaganda shield for Israel to continue what it's doing. Yeah, you look at it differently. I certainly will never look at the New York Times the same, and I don't think I have any friends who are Zionists, so I don't think I'm personally losing any friendships over that, but I certainly would.
Right. I mean, you mentioned the New York Times, and it's more than just the Times, CNN, a lot of the major media
Yeah,
corporations. They seem to have a lot of complicity. If you look at the way some of the stories are framed, they're like, babies die or some like children killed. They never say who killed them, how they were killed.
right.
And that's one
Yeah, it's just
point.
like children are just randomly dying in Gaza. Someone should look into that.
Yeah, it's like a 3-year-old found dead, like how was someone,
Hmm.
how are you found dead? And then that's one thing is like the headlines framing the headlines in a certain way. And then the other thing is the absolute complicity, like in some of the fake stories of the beheaded babies,
Yeah.
a lot of the debunked rape stories. The problem is like when the stories are debunked, you don't really see a clear recantation. They're kind of like in the back pages or kind of very,
Hmm.
well, it could have been, we're not sure. And once you frame someone, in this society, if you say, like person X kill somebody or rape somebody, and then they didn't, and you don't retract that, people just remember what you said initially, and I think a part of that, in my opinion, was manufactured to kind of aid the genocide and kind of provide cover for Israel. And now, it's too late when the damage has been done.
So I wouldn't say that it's too late at all. It is important that we fight this misinformation on multiple fronts. We have to recognize that regardless of anything that happened on October 7th, Palestinian humanity, the lives of innocent people are paramount, and that no actions on October 7th could justify what Israel has done and what Israel continues to do. But we also have to recognize that this was deliberate, dehumanizing misinformation, and that the people who caused it, who led to it, which of course is Israel and the IDF. One thing to recognize is that nothing that Israel says can be trusted. Anything that they say should immediately be recognized as a lie, and that anyone reporting these statements of Israeli officials, Israeli politicians, are complicit in spreading that lie. And then you have to also recognize that as you say, the New York Times, CNN, they are taking editorial positions, which is that we are going to support this war, and we are going to take a stance where Palestinians die, whereas Israelis are murdered horribly. Right? That is not a neutral statement to take. The idea that the New York Times or CNN is neutral in this is laughable. And we have to continue to call them to account and continue to say this is not okay. If you have a New York Times subscription, you should drop it, and you should send them a letter saying why you're dropping it. And we have to actively fight this.
Yeah, I mean it's difficult, but I agree. Unless we actively fight it and we don't speak up the truth, then those lies cannot be debunked. But I have noticed kind of a shift in the narrative, like you mentioned it earlier on, in terms of the sentiment. But I think it's going to be a long battle to kind of change that. So
Well, this is part of why we started Tech for Palestine. One of the projects that we have in Tech for Palestine is called October 7th Fact Check. It's at oct7factcheck.com. And it goes through each of the lies that Israel puts out. And it goes through them to say who said it first? What do we know about this? How did it spread? And ultimately, what actual facts do we have? And you mentioned the 40 beheaded babies. Right, it's a really good example because I think only one baby was killed in October 7th. And it is believed to have been killed by Israel, but that is not certain. But we know for a definitive fact by the information that Israel has put out that 40 babies were not killed. That could not possibly have happened. But we see that Biden said it, right? So we can see that how quickly those things spread. And October 7th Fact Check goes through each of those stories, those lies, so that we can more adequately debunk them.
I think you mentioned Biden a couple of times. What are your thoughts on the political fallout? I know a lot of people that I wouldn't say they're Democrat, but they're, anti-Trump or I would say more left-leaning in thinking, but not necessarily Democrats. And, they said that they're going to sit out this election. Some are asking, should we vote for Trump? But they don't really like him either because he's very, xenophobic and anti-Muslim, and he's got a million problems of his own. So I feel like there's a lot of people, at least I don't know how many people there are, but that are not going to vote for Biden and maybe just sit out this election or maybe vote for Jill Stein or Cornel West. What's your thoughts on the political fallout?
I think that Biden is going to lose. And I think that the step that they need to take in order to rectify that needs to be huge. They need to basically recognize Palestine in the United Nations, and to remove their veto of Security Council actions to end this war. I think people recognize that Biden is a genocidalist, right? The things that we said that we were worried that Trump is going to do, Biden is doing. And I'm not saying that Trump isn't going to do them too, right? Trump is also an awful person. And I'm not even advocating, whether you should do, uncommitted or whether you should vote for Biden. But when I've spoken to Arabs about this situation, I remember there was a conversation I had with a young Arab woman recently, where we were talking about this situation, and she said, you know, we are very aware of who Trump is and what he does and what he says, and we are still refusing to vote for Biden. And the reason is that Biden is doing it. It is a red line for most people to vote for someone who is committing a genocide. And that is ultimately what Biden is doing.
And during these events, even there was like Bernie Sanders, who's generally lauded as more of a champion of human rights compared to like the typical politician. He didn't think that there should have been a ceasefire, and he was also asked many times, "Would you call this a genocide?" He didn't, and he also said, he didn't think that he didn't have like necessarily opinion on American or British troops fighting for the IDF. He said that seems okay, but he wouldn't recommend it. So even some of the politicians that were more hopeful haven't been as good as one would like. What were your thoughts on that?
My sense is that, what everyone has been saying for years about it's not really a two-party system. It's one party system, but we color some of them blue and we color some of them red. That's not quite true, but you can see a lot of truth in it. The idea that Sanders would, be so willing to fight for, a $25 minimum wage, or, forgiveness of college debt, and wouldn't have the moral backbone to stand up and say, end the killing of innocent people. It's disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely disheartening. In terms of the IDF, troops fighting for the IDF from America and England, I want to just give you a short little story. About a decade ago, my cousin actually wrote this article. Tom Brady, I don't know if you're familiar with him, a football player who was a quarterback for the Patriots. Yeah, I think maybe even 15, 20 years ago, he went to Israel, donned the IDF clothing. He went shooting with them, maybe at the behest of his owner, who was a Zionist. And then he wrote an article with a thought experiment, like no one batted an eye that Tom Brady was, wearing the clothes of like a foreign army that was occupying, that was committing massacres. Not that Brady was doing it, but he was donning those clothes. And so he wrote an article. What if you did a thought experiment and then Tom Brady did that with ISIS, where they're also killing innocent
Mm-hmm.
people? And he said for ISIS, even we'd all be up in arms, but for IDF, it was like Tom Brady just goes shooting. And now you actually have American and British troops who are going to fight. And I don't think anyone can say that there's a just war here. It's a genocide. It's one-sided, and they don't even need the help of American or British troops. Let's say even if it just seems like I don't understand how that's allowable in these countries to fight for a foreign army. Even if it's an ally.
I mean, whether or not it is, we use the word genocide for the overall situation, whether or not the ICJ can prevent it or the United States can prevent it, war crimes remain war crimes. Like Patty said, if you commit a war crime, you have committed a war crime and you can be prosecuted for that. And we should prosecute every single one of them that comes back. The idea that you can go and, on this little jaunt to take part in the murder of civilians, and that you can just take, that uniform and join that army without consequences is absurd. We're seeing the consequences for some of them that are actually being killed out there, but the ones who come back should 100% be prosecuted. We know that the American ones won't, but in many countries, South Africa has announced that it will prosecute the people who come back after fighting in the IDF. And I think that's really important because it's something that says that the actions are not okay and that people who are taking part in them bear that culpability. And you talked about Tom Brady, but there's a sitting politician in Congress, I think his name is Brian Slate, who wears an IDF uniform in Congress. I, I don't even know what to say about that. It's so absurd.
Yeah, it is absurd. I think there was a politician, I don't remember who it was, that on her Twitter background, instead of an American flag, she has an Israeli flag. And I mean,
My
again,
God.
that doesn't make sense if you're an American politician. I wanted to get your thoughts on Aaron Bushnell. Now, he's the U.S. Military. I'm not sure if he was in the Marines,
I
who
believe he was a Marine.
yeah, Marine. So a few weeks ago, he went in front of the Israeli embassy, and as a sign of protest, he had a very powerful protest, but ended up in self-immolation, burned himself. And today, I think I read something. One of his friends said that Aaron had told him that he was involved in, military intelligence and that U.S. troops were actually on the ground in Gaza. Something I've heard. It's not been verified, of course, but that's something that bothered him. So I've heard different things about Bushnell. He's a hero, he's a martyr, he's crazy. He shouldn't have done that, obviously. But what are your thoughts on Aaron Bushnell?
There's a thing that you said where he ended up self-immolating. And I just wanted to correct that a little bit because it was a very deliberate decision, based on all the evidence that we've seen. It was a very deliberate decision that Aaron Bushnell took to draw attention to the genocide that the United States is participating in. The people of Palestine have called him a martyr, so I don't think that I could say anything except agree with them on that. I think it was exceptionally courageous, and I think that it had a huge impact, and he should obviously be regarded as a hero.
It's interesting once that news came out that apparently this happened earlier in December in Atlanta, and I that news was completely suppressed because I've been following this Gaza and Palestine news very avidly, and I did not know about that, or it kind of completely slipped by.
Mhm.
Were you aware of the first time that this happened, or was the Bushnell the first time you heard about it as well?
I think I had seen something about it. I hadn't seen any details about it. My understanding is it's a woman and that she survived, and is still alive, but that no one knows who she is, but they do know what hospital she's currently recuperating in.
Kamala Harris recently said that she wants a 6 week ceasefire. To me, that seems diabolical. I think at the end, I mean, if anyone wants a ceasefire, it should be permanent. The goal is to have peace on both sides, for no babies to be killed, for less people to be starving. I think in your blog, I think you mentioned like imagine turning off the water and electricity to 2 million people. And this is worse. You turn off electricity and the water and the communication and food, and then you start bombing them. So when she called for a 6 week ceasefire, my first thought was, after 6 months of slaughter, is the goal to restart, at that point? Like, I didn't understand that. And I found that very disturbing that someone would only ask for a temporary ceasefire. The goal for should be to stop this.
I think it sounds very cynical. 6 weeks gets you past most of the important elections in the US. So calling for a ceasefire allows them to get past the uncommitted vote, which is causing a lot of problems for them politically. So yeah, it's very difficult to see this as anything but completely cynical. The challenge with the ceasefire is that Israel is not participating at all. Hamas, you can read the news articles about what's happening with the ceasefire. Hamas is coming up with good faith. Here's how we'll release the hostages. Here's what we'll exchange the hostages for. They're asking for things that are not just extremely reasonable, but are actually, things that are illegal for Israel to do. They're asking for them to stop doing those illegal things. So, for example, all of the hostages that Israel has captured or put into administrative, what it calls administrative detention, which is basically the same thing as hostages. It's asking our hostages for your hostages, and to resume aid, which Israel is required to do by law, for Israel to pull out of Gaza, which it is also required to do by law. The United States and Israel are both participating in negotiations in extreme bad faith. And it's all just part of their propaganda efforts. It really seems like what Israel actually wants to do is kill every Palestinian or wipe them or remove them from Gaza. Kamala, just as cynical and conniving as the rest of them.
Yeah, you're talking about cynicism. I mean, the way the aid is being dispersed is also, it seems cynical. Right now, there are many, many aid trucks that have been stuck at the Egyptian border for months, full of food. And also then there aid coming in from apparently the Israeli side or from Jordan that is being blocked by protesters in Israel. And then the US is airdropping packets. There was also the flower massacre recently where, people
Mm-hmm.
were trying to get food and then they were shot. the option is, do you try to feed your family because there's starvation is going on, or do you risk dying trying to get food? So the whole concept of aid, there are a lot of people I know, a lot of countries and NGOs trying to bring in aid, but they're not letting it in.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that the lack of aid is a completely manufactured problem. Israel is deliberately preventing that aid from coming in, and whether that the country in its official capacity, which is doing things like rejecting cargo if it has, rejecting an entire truck if it has something that they have decided not to let in, and they've decided not to let in things like insulin, other vital medical and humanitarian aid. So they're rejecting it on that basis in an official capacity. But there's also the fact that Israeli citizens are organizing protests. They even set up a fun fair, a carnival, in front of the gates to prevent that aid from coming in. And it's being done by the IDF, by the Israeli government, and by the Israeli citizens. And I think as you start to look into this, you start to realize that all of Israel is participating in this genocide, that the news stations, the media, the people, the army, everything is aligned. They disagree about some things, right? They disagree about whether certain Orthodox Jews should be conscripted, or they disagree, whether Netanyahu should still be prosecuted for the things that he did before. But the polls in Israel are extremely pro-war. They're extremely pro the what is being done to Gazans, to Palestinians in Gaza. And as we, hopefully at some point we'll get to a ceasefire and we'll get to the day after. And I think the big question is going to do is what are we going to do about Israel?
One of the other stories that's being underreported is what's happening in the West Bank, because Gaza obviously is in dire circumstances and is obviously the priority to talk about, and in terms of help. But even in the West Bank, there's been hundreds of kids and young people as well as older people who have been shot and imprisoned, and killed, during this massacre. And situation there is getting quite worse. More people are losing their land, their houses, being evicted from their villages. They're using this opportunity when everyone's distracted with Gaza to kind of turn on the heat in the West Bank and make it difficult for Palestinian civil life there, way more than usual, which is already terrible.
It's important to remember that Hamas is not in the West Bank, right? So the excuses that Israel gives for why they should be allowed to do this genocide in Gaza, we can see that they're hollow because what they're doing in the West Bank is completely disconnected. And the only thing you can conclude is that they're doing this on purpose, which is, of course, what Palestinians have been telling us for 75 years and, holds up with the entire history of Israel. So I think there's no way that after this ends, we can go back to the status quo. It's something where this whole thing has to, have a stop to put to it right now.
So one of the questions a friend asked me at the very beginning of this massacre or genocide, however you want to term it, is does this just come down to racism? And I was going to give a really long-winded answer about like the Nakba and this and that. And then I said, yeah, probably. How would you answer that question?
I mean, it's 100% racism. Zionism is fundamentally racism, right? It's the idea that this group of people gets rights and this other group of people doesn't get rights, and whether those are based on a religion or a skin color or an ethnicity or whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. That is racism, and you look at it as when you look at people calling this an apartheid, right? That is exactly what it is. There's a set of rights for one group of people. There's a set of rights that another group of people doesn't get, and the distinction is made on their race. So Jewish Israelis get one set of rights, Arabs get another set of rights. A friend of mine explained it to me as the Palestinians aren't second class citizens in Israel. They're about seventh class citizens in Israel. And there's a complex hierarchy of racism within Israel where where some Israelis have more rights than other Israelis, and then Arab Israelis get fewer rights, and Palestinians get fewer rights, and they get rights depending on whether they live in East Jerusalem or whether they live in area A, B, or C, or whether they live in Gaza. It's not just like the concept of Zionism is racist, which it is. It's also Israel is a deeply racist society.
Seems like you've pivoted a lot of your time from the tech world to spending on Gaza activism, which is very admirable. How do you talk to people to make sure that their fatigue doesn't set in? I think it's somewhat natural, half a year in, people's focus kind of shifts to regular day-to-day stuff and less so on this. Is there a way to combat that? Or, is that just by doing things like Tech for Palestine that would kind of keep it in the sight of people?
I don't think there's any risk of this becoming, well, I think there's a risk, but I don't see it happening. What I see is happening is that every month, popular opinion around the world changes significantly against Israel and against what Israel is doing. Next month will be a dramatic change from this month, which is a dramatic change from last month. And that manifests in what people say, it manifests in what politicians say, it manifests in the protests, but it also manifests in what Israel is doing. Because you see that the propaganda that's out there gets more and more desperate every month. It used to be that accusations of anti-Semitism were career ending. Now people can see that accusations of anti-Semitism are just weaponizing Israeli propaganda, and it almost doesn't have a meaning anymore. And that was impossible to believe that might have been the situation 5 months ago. We are truly in unprecedented times where the entire world is turning on Israel, and that will start to manifest a lot more aggressively in coming months with boycotts, with changing in US politicians' demeanor and stances, but it will also change in terms of the international community leaving the United States behind and starting to take action themselves. Yes, that everyone has this fear, but I think probably, that's not how things have trended recently.
What do you think is the optimal solution? I know you're not a Palestinian, so do you have any personal opinions on a one state or a two-state solution? I mean, ideally, in my opinion, maybe it's because I'm biased by living in the West, but even historically, pre-occupation, I think Muslims, Jews, Christians lived in peace together. And I always feel personally that, if people are willing to kind of let go, one state in harmony would be ideal, I think, but I don't know, that's not a decision for me to make, but do you have any personal opinion on that?
I like to defer to Palestinians about this. An interesting note is that Palestinians and anti-Zionist Jews often end up in the same place, which is that a one-state solution is the only possible alternative. I think that there's a two-state solution is obviously easier to get to. It's something that could almost be done in a day if they get I know it's not as simple as that, but UN recognition is something that like basically creates a de facto two-state solution, even if there's many things to change after that. And I could see that being a step on the way to a one-state solution, but it's very difficult to see which way it ends up. I think really depends on the specifics, and I've seen a lot of different proposals for how specifically a one-state solution happens. But I think really what's going to change it is just how bad of a pariah, or what affects this is how bad of a pariah Israel makes itself in the world. Because you could end up with a two-state solution today, but if we go, a year or two down the line and Israel continues acting the way that it's acting, it is going to have completely alienated the entire international community to a point where almost the only option is for a one-state solution to be imposed on them. And I'm very, very new to this sort of thing. I'm learning as I go, but that's that's what I've learned so far. And my personal thing that I refer to is the Good Friday Agreement. So the Good Friday Agreement was the peace agreement that led to a lasting peace in Northern Ireland. I don't think it's necessarily, or I don't think it's in any way a model for this, But it is something where both sides came together and, put to paper that they agreed that this was the way they were going forward. And so I refer to looking for a Good Friday Agreement, whatever that is in this particular case, as the day that we know that this thing will be over.
Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you'd like to say?
There was a thing that you asked me before about Tech for Palestine, and what we do, and I wanted to highlight some of the projects that we've created in Tech for Palestine. I mentioned ox7factcheck.com. We have a number of other projects that are really interesting that I think people would enjoy. So one, a profile pic maker. So you can add a Palestinian flag to your Twitter or Instagram avatar. One that's come out of our community is called NewsCord, which allows you to compare news sources and understand the bias in them. We've recently released one called Words of Justice, wordsofjustice.org, which helps people promote Palestinian advocacy on social media. There's a beautiful one called Birds of Gaza, which helps children understand the trauma of what's happening in Gaza by the medium of coloring in birds representing children that have been killed. And then one of my favorites, IsraeliTechAlternatives.com, which is a tool that allows people to find alternatives to Israeli tech companies so that they can help boycott and apply pressure to the Israeli ecosystem.
Oh, that's awesome. And we'll include, any links in the show notes. Any place where you'd like to send people or where they can find you online?
Yeah, so if you go to techforpalestine.org, you can sign up for our mailing list there, and then we send out alerts about every project that we release, and all of these come from members of our community who are, finding ways to advocate for Palestine in one way or the other.
Well, thank you very much for coming on to the Ozone Podcast. I know you're in demand and you're very busy in both, the tech world and advocacy. So I really appreciate you coming on and spending time and giving your thoughts.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated it.
I mentioned that Paul Biggar's first startup, Circle CI, is a unicorn. For those unaware of that terminology, it's basically a private company that's reached a valuation of $1 billion or more and it's not been listed on the stock market. A unicorn is basically every founder's dream, and it shows how impressive Paul's resume is. And I think it also shows Paul's courage that he could easily have kind of ignored what's going on in Palestine and focused in on his own career, but he chose to take a more difficult path and speak up for those who can and fight for justice. And I think that's praiseworthy and should set an example for others. One of the topics that we didn't get a chance to talk about is bias in AI. A lot of the AI algorithms that are being programmed, including Chat GPT, are by Zionist entities or those that don't believe in Palestinian freedom and could also have similar biases and support only the dominant narratives. I think that's something to be careful with while using AI and in the development of that technology. That's all for today's show, and thank you for listening. Please subscribe to wherever you're listening to the podcast, leave a review and rating as it helps others find the show. Until next time, I'm out.